this is complicated, and it's not as easy as the U.S. is this or the Cuban government is that, and it's not as black and white. It's really complicated and nuanced. We went down there, and people on the U.S. side, academics, creatives, business leaders, with their counterparts in countries that were on the cusp of dramatic change, and had an opportunity to meet entrepreneurs who are solving real problems in their neighborhood through the most, technologically and politically constrained environments. They were building a Yelp-like product with, unreliable mobile service, no official mobile service, right? Everything's sort of on Wi-Fi. They were restaurateurs that were, husband-wife team who had worked professionally for, 40 years before retiring into a life of opening up an Indian restaurant and a sort of like a cheesecake factory for Cuban food type restaurant, everything your grandma would serve, type of a place without any sort of wholesale restaurant. And if you really wanted to like end the Cuban, regime, overnight, you would just drop the embargo. And just allow capital to flow. And you can't get that sort of political will. And for, my entire childhood is just like sort of portrayed as this really kind of dark other of communism in Cuba, and those that stayed behind or those that couldn't get out. And it's very complicated in South Florida. And, I think and it was hard on my family, right? Because like my dad was kind of like almost open to coming to Cuba, and then, couldn't bring himself to do it. Just I think, combination of my grandmother's, sort of like wish of like, hey, don't go back because I don't know if you'll be able to get out. Just sort of the way that splits folks apart. And the hard part for me was, I got to sit in the living room of my father's childhood home with my grandma's oldest and my grandma's youngest cousin, and break bread and have dinner and, share a box of photos and see, sort of the generational divisiveness that, the failed policy on both the U.S. side and the Cuban side have caused on families. And the second time that I got to go, I, called my grandma or they called us from the States, and I got to, be listening to like a landline, phone while her cousin was talking to her, and they're sort of like, who would have thought, right? Like, imagine here, I'm sitting here with your grandson, and he looks exactly like what your expected your son to look like, and I never had a chance to see them, and it was heartbreaking, and I really tried to get my dad to go on that trip, and he wouldn't, and I think that was 2016 was the last time I went down there, and my grandma's oldest cousin passed away a year later, and my grandma passed last year, and so there is no going back, and then there's no way of seeing that. And you think about that's just one, sort of connection. You multiply that times the hundreds of thousands of Cubans that have that sort of diaspora between those that could have and those that didn't, and the complexity between the two. And I think for me, it was important being part of that conversation. The way I rationalized it with my dad is like, if not me, who has the context of how complex this is and how nuanced this is, you're going to get some random person from Cincinnati, Ohio, who's trying to like start a business down there with, and is yelling loudly at the next table about, how much money they're going to make on this thing. I mean, I think for me, Cuba was a way to connect my personal past with my professional present, looking towards an indeterminate future. And I think that the future that came out of it, unfortunately, was not what any of us had anticipated. And I think part of it was the macro picture changed so dramatically. If we had continued on that course, the embargo might be gone. It might have been lifted, and we might have a much different story where there is stronger partnership, between Cuba and the United States and South Florida in really interesting ways. But it didn't happen. It could have, but it didn't.